Hello, I'm Alex and welcome to the History Chronicles. If you like our work, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel in return for exclusive perks, please visit our Patreon page. Now, on with the video. Today's History Chronicles begins with a fact and a preface. There are 574 federally recognized Native American tribes in the United States, and so the story for some of the more prominent tribes will not always be representative of the experience of all Native American tribes. The true origin of Native Americans has been hotly contested between historians, archaeologists, genealogists, as well as the Native American community themselves. One of the most common suggestions is that they passed over the Bering Land Bridge, which formed during the Ice Age between 30,000 and 16,000 years ago. Evidence for this theory includes the lack of humanoid skeletal remains from here, of either Neanderthals or other humans. Some biological anthropologists agree with this theory. Studying both blood and dental records, they found characteristics which support the theory. Also, campfire remains in the Valley of Mexico have been dated to 21,000 BC, and Australian Aborigine genes can be found in Latin Americans, leading to arguments of settlement and the eventual extinguishing of the original culture by later Native American cultures. Others argue that Northwest Pacific peoples have striking similarities to Japanese culture, including warrior outfits that model closely to Japanese armor of the time. Another theory claims that the lost tribe of Israel is responsible for the population of the Americas pre-European contact, but there is hardly any supporting evidence for this. More recently, in 1996, two men found the remains of Kennewick Man in Washington state. It was a contentious discovery, as many believe the man's skull to look Caucasian, but ultimately, dental records linked the 9,500-year-old remains to a possible connection with South Asian peoples. However, Native Americans have their own explanations for their arrival on the continent. The Iroquois told stories of a woman who lived in a sky dome, who either had been banished by her husband or fell through a hole towards Earth. She was caught by birds who slowed her fall to Earth and helped her land on a turtle. From there, the animals of the Earth gathered soils and created land, building a place where she and her descendants could live. Meanwhile, the story of the Lakota people's origin revolves around Wind Cave, which some of the early Lakota, having been tricked, left the cave earlier than what their creator had instructed. Those who left Wind Cave early were turned into bison by their creator. When the time to leave Wind Cave came, the remaining Lakota people were instructed to follow the bison, as the bison would provide everything they need to survive on Earth. Some of the first signs of an identifiable culture related to modern-day Native Americans are the Clovis Hunters, a pre-Paleo-Indian culture named after the town in New Mexico where the first evidence of them were found. The Clovis culture is defined by their fluted stone-shaped spear points, which were likely used to hunt mammals such as mammoths, mastodons, extinct bison species, gomphotheres, and camelops. The decline of their culture is thought to be a result of the disappearance of their megafauna prey. Whether they were directly responsible for the decline of their prey is highly speculative, but they would nonetheless give way to other cultures. The next major period of Native American history would occur during the Archaic Period, from 7000 to 2000 BC. This period would be known for the beginning of agriculture in Native American societies. Crops such as beans, pumpkins, gourds, and maize, or corn, were grown. In time, the Archaic Period would lead into the Woodland Period, a brief continuation of the Archaic Period, but with extensive mound building. The Woodland Period would be split between the early, middle, and late periods, and could be seen as a golden age for Native American culture. Starting in 800 BC, the Adena Culture was located primarily in the state of modern-day Ohio, and branched into Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Their name came from the mound located on Thomas Worthington's estate, named Adena, which was located near Chillicothe, Ohio. The Adena culture is known for their large burial mounds, pottery, and extensive trade network. This trade network included goods such as copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf Coast. They primarily used stone tools and copper, which they traded for ornamental use, such as rings, necklaces, and other items. The Adena culture would disappear in around 100 AD. During the middle of the Adena culture, the Anazazi Culture appeared. Starting in 100 BC, the Anazazi were known for their pit houses and their signature black on white pottery work. Towards 750 AD, the Anazazi began to live in above-ground dwellings but kept the pit house as a kiva, which would be used by men for ceremonial and social purposes. At the same time as the Anazazi were becoming a distinct culture, the Hopewell culture emerged from the Adena. The Hopewell would use the same trade networks and continued the tradition of burial mounds, although they were reserved only for special religious leaders. One of the more impressive mound structures built are the Newark earthworks, located in Newark, Ohio. These mounds include the Great Circle, Octagon, and Wright Mounds, and may have been used as a major religious and scientific center for the Native Americans to track the moon's orbit. The Mississippian culture became prominent in 800 BC in the Mississippi River region. It had 5 distinct culture groups. The Middle Mississippians inhabited the largest territory in the heart of the Mississippian culture group. They were followed by the South Appalachian Mississippians, who were located in the heart of Georgia and South Carolina. The Caddoan Mississippians inhabited a small region between Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. Another Mississippian culture was the Plaquemine, who lived primarily in Upper Louisiana. Lastly, the Fort Ancient culture, who was also a part of the Mississippian culture, had roots in Ohio by 1000 AD. While it was contested as to who built it, the Serpent Mound, located in Adams County, Ohio, is generally attributed to Fort Ancient culture and is the largest serpent effigy mound in the world. By the time European settlers began to enter into the Ohio Valley in the 1700s, Fort Ancient culture had disappeared. Native American experience would change greatly with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, arriving in the New World and landing on the island of Guanan, later to become known as San Salvador. In the ensuing decades, other explorers such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, primarily sailing under the Spanish flag, landed in Central and South America, encountering the Aztec, Mayan, and Incan empires. As a result of the contact made by the Spanish and other Europeans, the Native American population dropped dramatically. Pre-Columbus, there was an estimated 60 million Native Americans, but as a result of diseases, famines, and war, the population would drop to 6 million. The effects of contact were widespread, as before Europeans had successfully landed in St. Augustine, Jamestown, and Plymouth, disease had devastated major portions of the Native American population. This illustrates how connected the Native American population would have been to far-reaching consequences in areas Europeans had not set foot in. The Spanish would continue to have contact with Native Americans as they continued to expand their control into the American Southwest, encountering the Pueblo, Apaches, Navajos, and Hopis. France and England would themselves enter into the colonial expansion later, as France would found Newfoundland in 1534, while Jamestown was founded in 1607 by the English. The French would manage better relationships with the Native Americans, as they did not come in the same numbers as the English did, and were often more tolerant of Native American traditions. The English would make powerful alliances with the Powhatans in Virginia and the Wampanoag in Massachusetts, a move which would see both colonies prosper and grow under their protection. But once their protection was no longer needed, these tribes would eventually be pushed out of their ancestral lands. As European settlement expanded along the east coast of North America, they became more involved in Native American politics, such as the continued conflict between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Algonquin. Meanwhile, in the West, the arrival of the Spanish had brought the Native Americans a tool that would greatly change the way they lived their lives: horses. Horses had been present in North America before, but had died out. But with the arrival of the Spanish, horses once again roamed the continent. By the 1600s, horses had reached the Comanches and the Kiowa, and by the 1720s they had reached the Blackfoot and the Sioux. Hunting became easier and a population resurgence occurred, as the Native American tribes became more mobile and adopted a nomadic way of life. On the East Coast, Native Americans' political problems soon began to mirror European affairs, as Native American tribes took sides, choosing between the British and the French in a series of conflicts. It was a delicate balance which would be maintained until the French and Indian Wars, which saw the defeat of the French and the effective end of balance in the North American continent. But while the British tried to maintain good relations, their colonists did not, and continued to encroach on Native American lands. Ultimately, the British would lose control of their colonies in the American Revolution, starting a new era of Native American politics. The Ohio River Valley soon became contested, as tribes such as the Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware, who had already been pushed from their native homelands, found themselves faced with an expanding United States. Under the guidance of the Shawnee war chief Tecumseh, a pan-Native American alliance was formed in an effort to stop the expansion. Tecumseh would lead troops in the War of 1812 and be killed in the Battle of the Thames in 1813. And with him, any hope of successful Native American resistance also died. As a result of the loss of the War of 1812, Native Americans would suffer under a policy called removal, first formulated by John C. Calhoun, President Monroe's Secretary of War, which would see Native Americans relocated to the west of the Mississippi River with the promise that these new lands would be theirs to keep. Removal in the southeast would be the most well known, when the so-called 5 civilized tribes were forcefully removed. These Native American nations, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminoles, and Cherokee, had begun to adapt European customs and culture, with the most famous removal being the Cherokee's Trail of Tears. Following the American Civil War, which saw involvement from Native American tribes siding with the Confederacy, America refocused on expanding into land it had promised would be set aside for Native Americans. As a result, a series of wars would take place, starting in 1846 and ending in 1886. One of those conflicts included the Apaches and their war chief Geronimo, whose name would be used to inspire courage in World War II parachutists when they jumped out of their planes. The Apache weren't the only Native American group to face forced relocation, as a series of wars were fought to enforce reservation life. Such wars included the Red Cloud War from 1866 to 1868 and the Great Sioux War from 1876 to 1877. By 1924, the nomadic lifestyle of the Plains Native Americans came to an end, as they had by then been forced onto reservations. In an effort to incorporate Native Americans into American society, children were forced from their homes and relocated to residential schools in an effort to educate them. Unfortunately, many children did not survive their time at these residential schools, whether from the abuse of the teachers or from diseases that became rampant in these schools. It became a commonly quoted phrase, the need to kill the Indian and save the man, in an effort to introduce them into the workforce. By the 1930s, a new effort had begun to undo the acts of government with the Indian Reorganization Act, later called the Indian New Deal, which began to loosen the federal restrictions placed upon them and allow self-governance once again. It would allow for the return of significant cultural material, including language, which would become important during World War II as the Navajo code talkers became an intrinsic part of the Pacific Campaign. By the 1960s and 70s, as part of a broader civil rights movement, organizations such as Women of All Nations, or WARM, the National Indian Youth Council, or NIYC, and the American Indian Movement, or AIM, were formed. Of these, the AIM movement would be the most influential and radical of the groups. While they mainly relied on peaceful protest, violence did erupt in the town of Wounded Knee, which was an already contentious site from an earlier massacre of Native Americans in the 1890s. Along with the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota as part of the movement. Those who are actively engaged within the Native American communities and living on the reservations to this day face numerous challenges. As a result of their isolated locations, Native Americans tend to be impoverished and unemployed. This stems from a lack of work opportunities as well as education, and as a result, they often live in substandard housing conditions. The impoverishment of Native Americans has also led to an increased rate of violence against women and children, along with increased use of drugs and alcohol abuse. They also have inadequate access to healthcare, voting, and other civil rights. Lastly, they face cultural extinction due to decades of cultural suppression by the United States government. Native Americans are not a people of the past, as they are still present and play an active role in shaping the American image. Many of their current struggles are a result of neglect from the federal government and broken treaty promises. Native Americans still deal with the trauma they endured and continue to endure as a result of the practices of the United States government. Yet the future is hopeful, as key Native American issues have begun to gain coverage, and with enough media attention, the change needed for their community may just come. You've been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to know what you think of the history of Native Americans. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the History Chronicles.